In the far reaches of the world, where the winds stir the endless forests of ancient, forgotten lands, there lay a people whose name would echo in whispered legends, silent, elusive, and feared by those who ventured too far into their domain. This place, shrouded in mystery and time, was known as Bjarmaland, land of the Bjarmians. And it is here, in the quietest, most distant corners of the earth, that our story begins. Softly, gently, and with the promise of more to unfold as we step into the long shadows cast by time itself. Bjarmaland, you see, was not a land found on most maps of the world. It lay far to the north, where the snow covered the earth in layers so thick it seemed as though the land had been untouched for millennia. A place where the sunlight lingered in the twilight hours of summer, but never quite reached the depths of winter's frozen grasp. The silence of this place was profound, an almost sacred stillness that could only be broken by the whispering winds that twisted through the towering ancient trees of the white forest, and perhaps the occasional echo of a distant voice calling through the icy fog to the very edge of what was known. Bjarmaland was a land far beyond the reach of the Vikings, those seafaring people who had already crossed vast oceans, braved hostile shores, and reached the most distant corners of the known world. Yet even they, those fierce adventurers, who believed no land was too remote, no challenge too daunting, feared the lands of the Bjarmians. It was a place that both called to them with the promise of riches and repelled them with the unknown. An alluring invitation that held a dark, foreboding edge. The Vikings, with their longships cutting through the water like the sharp edge of a sword, had ventured far and wide, their sights set on the treasures of faraway lands. They explored the shores of what we now call Scotland, the British Isles, the vast coasts of Ireland, and even the distant shores of the Mediterranean. Yet, in their quest for new lands, they had also cast their gaze eastward, toward the frozen expanse of the north, to a place where few had dared to follow. It was here, in the shadow of the Arctic Circle, where the Bjarmians lived, deep in the heart of the northern wilderness. Known also as the Bjarmia, or Barma, their name would forever be whispered in the sagas, written in the language of myth and legend, a people who existed in the margins of the Viking world, neither entirely understood nor fully explored, but always present in the background of the Vikings' vast travels. The first mentions of these mysterious people came not from direct encounters, but from the stories passed between those who ventured close enough to hear their name spoken in hushed tones. The Bjarmians were said to be a people of the forest, a strange and silent folk, skilled in the ways of the wild, living in isolation far from the prying eyes of the world. They were a tribe whose very existence seemed to hover on the edge of myth, a whisper in the wind, a shadow in the snow-covered forests that stretched endlessly into the horizon. In the sagas, which were the lifeblood of Viking storytelling, the Bjarmians were spoken of as a formidable presence. They were described not as mere raiders or conquerors, but as a people who stood apart, whose connection to the land and the ancient untamed forces of nature seemed so deep that even the Vikings, the boldest of warriors, were cautious when speaking of them. The Bjarmians, it was said, were the watchers, the guardians of their land, and those who ventured too deep into their world did so at their own peril. Yet despite their mystery, the Bjarmians were not entirely isolated from the world. They were traders, like many of the people in the ancient north, and their land lay along the waterways that connected the distant east with the western shores. It was here, in these frozen rivers and lakes, that the Bjarmians made their living, navigating the ice and snow in ways that were beyond the comprehension of outsiders. They traded goods, furs and pelts, and it was said that their silks, and even their silver, were of a rare quality that caught the eye of many who passed through the northern reaches. But it was not just their goods that caught the attention of the Vikings, but their very existence. A quiet, yet persistent presence that seemed to haunt the periphery of Viking adventures. The Vikings, who had seen much of the world, were both intrigued and wary of the Bjarmians. They feared the legends that surrounded them, those tales of fierce warriors who could vanish into the forest like ghosts, or of strange figures who wandered the ice, their eyes reflecting the cold northern light. Yet in the earliest mentions of the Bjarmians in Norse texts, they were not simply feared, they were admired in a way. The Vikings were captivated by the mystery of the Bjarmians, a people who had no written history, no great sagas to sing of their deeds. Instead, they existed in the whispered words of those who had seen them from a distance, who had perhaps exchanged a glance or a nod with a traveller from the far north. They were a people both haunting and beautiful, strong in their silence, powerful in their connection to the land that they alone seemed to understand. As the Vikings pressed deeper into the northern realms, they would begin to encounter the Bjarmians more directly, though always at the edge of their journey, always on the borders of their world. Yet for all their curiosity, the Vikings could never quite bring themselves to fully understand the Bjarmians, whose ways remained a mystery, whose stories remained untold. It was this very enigma, the deep, quiet silence that surrounded them, that made the Bjarmians both a terror and a fascination for the Viking people, who had always prided themselves on their mastery of the known world. And so, the Bjarmians remained, a shadow on the horizon, a whisper in the wind, a people who existed on the edge of the Viking world, feared and revered in equal measure. Their true story would remain hidden, like the land they inhabited, distant, cold, and waiting to be discovered, if only one could find the way. For now, though, as the Viking ships glided through the northern waters, the Bjarmians remained where they had always been, beyond the reach of those who sought them, in a world where time moved slowly, and the secrets of the ages were preserved in the ancient, silent forests of the far north. Bjarmaland, the land where time seemed to pause, stretches out under a sky that never quite seems to hold the warmth of the sun for long. Here, in the far reaches of the northern world, the landscape is vast, cold, and untouched by the hands of men. The land lies in the shadow of the great white sea, its shores kissed by frigid waters that stretch all the way to the edge of the Arctic Circle. The sea itself, ancient and unyielding, acts as both a gateway and a barrier to the world beyond. It is a place where the horizon seems to stretch on forever, where the line between land and sky blurs in the dimming twilight hours of both day and night. The land of Bjarmaland, as vast as it is wild, is blanketed in snow for much of the year. Tall, dark trees rise from the earth like silent sentinels, massive pines, their needles sharp against the air, their trunks as gnarled and twisted as the ancient stories that have been passed through generations. These trees make up the great white forest, the forests that the Bjarmians called their home, and which earned their name from the way the snow clung to every branch, creating an ethereal, almost otherworldly atmosphere. The white forest was not just a physical place. It was an integral part of the very identity of the Bjarmians, a symbol of both shelter and danger, a place where the unknown lived and watched silently, always hidden from those who dared to venture too far in. To the Vikings, these trees represented the very boundary between what was known and what could never be fully understood. And within this vast, frozen wilderness, there was something more, something that echoed through the winds that swept across the tundra. The land itself seemed to hum with a strange energy. The wind would whisper through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and the sharp, fresh bite of snow. At times, the silence would fall so thick and heavy that it was almost as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to stir, or for someone to enter its world. To the Vikings, who were accustomed to the sounds of the seas and the hustle of their own homeland, this stillness was unsettling. The land of the Bjarmians, in all its frozen beauty, held a secret, an ancient presence that seemed to be watching, always watching, from within the deep shadows of the white forest. In this untamed wilderness, the Bjarmians lived in a way that seemed wholly different from the Vikings. They were a people born of the land itself, bound to the rhythms of nature in a way that was both foreign and awe-inspiring. The Bjarmians' existence was not defined by grand cities or great stone walls, but by the deep knowledge they had of the land around them. The wind, the trees, the rivers. They understood the language of nature, and it spoke to them in ways that the Vikings, with all their iron and fire, could never fully comprehend. The Sami people, who had long lived in these northern lands, shared in this ancient wisdom of the earth, their lives intricately woven into the landscape. The Sami, with their reindeer herds and their deeply spiritual connection to the land, were the original masters of these harsh northern climates. They had long traversed the vast stretches of tundra and forest that lay beyond the White Sea, living with a quiet grace that was alien to the brashness of the Viking way. For the Vikings, the Sami represented both a mystery and a part of the natural order of the land. Their ways were different, their customs strange, but they, too, were an undeniable presence in the northern world. The Bjarmians, much like the Sami, had their own ways of living with the land. Their settlements were small and scattered, often hidden deep within the forest or tucked along the banks of frozen rivers, blending seamlessly with the world around them. To the Viking eye, Bjarmaland was a land both alluring and terrifying. The vast stretches of tundra, broken only by the dark outline of the forest, or the occasional glimmer of a river winding its way through the snow, appeared beautiful but inhospitable. The ground here was not kind. It was frozen for much of the year, leaving little room for the fields and crops that the Vikings were used to. Instead, the Bjarmians survived on what the land could give them. The thick fur of animals that roamed the forests, the fish of the frozen rivers, and the ancient cold breath of the earth that gave life to the plants that clung stubbornly to the harsh terrain. This was a land where survival was not guaranteed. It was earned through the quiet persistence of those who knew how to read the land's signs and secrets. Yet, despite the harshness of the land, there was an undeniable allure. The Vikings, ever hungry for new opportunities, saw in Bjarmaland the promise of wealth. The forests, teeming with wildlife, offered valuable furs and pelts that were highly sought after in the markets of the south. The rivers that flowed like veins through the land were not only beautiful, but served as pathways, routes through which trade could pass from the remote north into the bustling cities and kingdoms of the east. The Bjarmians, with their intimate knowledge of these waterways, were skilled traders, their boats gliding across the frozen rivers with ease, carrying goods from the north to the far reaches of the known world. The earliest Viking settlers and traders who made their way into Bjarmaland did so with caution, aware of the untamed spirit that seemed to hang over the land. They encountered the Bjarmians in the frozen waters, along the riverbanks where the icy currents moved in slow, deliberate loops. The Viking ships, with their long, slender hulls and towering masts, would dock along the shores, their sails flapping softly in the biting wind. The traders would gather there, exchanging goods, furs, silver, and the fruits of the earth, but always under the watchful eyes of the Bjarmians, whose presence was like a shadow on the land. There was no warmth in these exchanges, only the cold, calculated negotiation of two peoples who existed in parallel worlds, one of iron and fire, the other of silence and snow. The settlements of the Bjarmians were often hidden from view, small enclaves tucked deep within the forest, where smoke rose from the chimneys of humble dwellings. The Bjarmians, unlike the more openly aggressive peoples the Vikings often encountered, held their space with quiet dignity. They were not inclined to engage in the loud, boisterous battles that marked the Viking raids on other lands. Instead, they were known for their subtlety, their ability to disappear into the woods like shadows, their lives wrapped in a quiet mystery that the Vikings could neither penetrate nor fully understand. Thus, the land of the Bjarmians, their home, their forest, their rivers, remained an enigma for the Vikings. It was a world of quiet beauty, of ancient woods and cold rivers, a place where survival was as much a spiritual act as it was a physical one. It was a world where the whispers of the past seemed to float on the wind, where the silence held memories of ancient times, and where the Bjarmians, silent and watchful, stood as guardians of a land both alluring and terrifying in its mystery. The Vikings, ever bold and ever curious, would return again and again to this land, hoping to understand it, to conquer it, or perhaps to simply learn from it. But the land of Bjarmaland, the land of the Watchers, would remain as it always had been, timeless, silent, and full of secrets waiting to be discovered, or left undisturbed, hidden in the shadows of the white forest. As the longships of the Vikings sailed further into the northern waters, whispers began to spread. Quiet words carried on the winds that seemed to reach even the farthest corners of their world. The voices spoke of a people living far to the northeast, beyond the known territories, where the land was untamed, and the forest whispered secrets older than time itself. These were not ordinary people, the stories said, but a people unlike any the Vikings had encountered in their long travels. A people who lived in the shadows of the great white forest, whose ways were as mysterious as the land they inhabited. They were the Bjarmians, and their name, spoken in hushed tones, filled the air with both intrigue and unease. The first recorded whispers of the Bjarmians came not from direct contact, but from the sagas, those ancient texts that captured the essence of Viking exploits and the strange peoples they encountered on their journeys. In the saga of the Knitlings and the saga of Hrolf-Kraki, the Bjarmians were mentioned, though only in fleeting glimpses. They were not yet fully known, but their presence was felt in the edges of the Viking world, in the places where the rivers met the sea, and where the ice and snow stretched into eternity. In these early accounts, the Bjarmians were described in ways that made the blood of the Viking explorers run cold. There was talk of mysterious figures moving through the dense forests, their forms hidden by the mist that hung in the trees like a veil, their eyes reflecting the pale northern light. The stories were sparse, but they painted a picture of a people who were both alluring and terrifying, whose very existence seemed to stir the ancient fears that had always lingered in the hearts of those who dared to venture beyond the familiar shores. The Vikings, those bold and fearless souls who had crossed vast seas and braved countless dangers, reacted to these whispers with a mixture of fear, intrigue, and awe. They were not a people easily shaken, for they had seen the bloodied shores of England, the gold-laden cities of the Mediterranean, and the frozen forests of Russia. Yet something about the Bjarmians stirred a deep, unspoken unease within them. Perhaps it was the isolation of the Bjarmians, their hidden ways, and their ability to remain untouched by the world around them. Perhaps it was their mysterious reputation, whispers of fierce warriors who could appear from the shadows, attacking with eerie skill, then vanish just as quickly into the forests. The sagas tell of the first few Viking explorers who, emboldened by tales of riches and strange lands, ventured into the northern wilderness, their longships cutting through the frozen waters toward the White Sea. They were driven by a desire for trade, for discovery, and for the chance to encounter new peoples whose ways they could either conquer or ally with. But what they found, when they reached the shores of Bjarmaland, was not what they had expected. There were no welcoming settlements, no bustling markets where they could trade their iron or silver for pelts and furs. Instead, there was only silence, the eerie, oppressive silence of the northern wilderness. And there, amid the trees of the White Forest, they would hear something far more unsettling: the presence of the Bjarmians, watching from the shadows. The early Viking explorers who first encountered the Bjarmians spoke little of their meetings, but what they did say painted a chilling picture of the people they had found. The Bjarmians were not like the other tribes they had encountered in their travels. They were not interested in conquest or trade in the same way as the people of the south. They were silent, their faces inscrutable, their eyes often turned toward the ground, as though they were listening for something the Vikings could not hear. Yet when the Bjarmians spoke, it was clear that they were not afraid. There was something in their gaze, something calm and unwavering, that made the Vikings uneasy. The Bjarmians were described as eerily skilled in battle, capable of moving through the dense forest with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. It was said that they could disappear into the woods without a sound, vanishing from sight as though they had never been there at all. Their weapons, too, were a source of mystery. While the Vikings were accustomed to their swords, axes, and spears, the Bjarmians wielded weapons of a different nature, simple but incredibly effective. Some stories spoke of their use of longbows, their arrows flying with the precision of a bird in flight. Others told of them wielding spears with such skill that they seemed to strike from the shadows, faster than the Vikings could react. It was as if the Bjarmians had mastered the art of blending with the land, becoming one with the trees and the snow, moving in ways that the Vikings could not hope to match. But it was not just their skills in battle that set the Bjarmians apart. It was the presence they carried with them, a presence that seemed to hang in the air like a heavy fog. It was as though the very land had chosen them as its guardians, and they, in turn, had become the keepers of its ancient secrets. The Bjarmians were not interested in war for the sake of war. They fought only when necessary, only when their land was threatened. But when they did fight, it was with an eerie calmness, a sense of inevitability that made their warriors seem almost invincible. In these early encounters, the Vikings began to hear of something even more mysterious: the figure of the Watcher, or the Guardian. It was said that the Bjarmians were not a people governed by kings or lords, but by something older, something deeper. Some accounts spoke of a single figure, cloaked in shadow, whose eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. This Watcher was said to be a protector of the land, a guardian of the ancient ways, watching over the Bjarmians and their domain with an unwavering vigilance. The Watcher, though never fully described, became a figure of great power in Bjarmian folklore, representing not just the strength of the Bjarmians, but their deep connection to the land itself. The first whispers of this figure, the Watcher, would reach the ears of Viking traders who, although fascinated by the Bjarmians, were equally terrified by the presence that seemed to follow them wherever they went. The Watcher, they said, was not a man, but something more: a spirit, a force of nature, or perhaps a god of the land itself. It was this figure, this silent, unseen force, that made Bjarmaland such a place of mystery. It was this figure that, even in the darkest hours, kept the land hidden from those who sought to conquer it, and it was this figure who kept the Vikings at bay, watching from the forest as they tried to understand the people who lived there. The first recorded encounters with the Bjarmians were not long and drawn-out battles or great exchanges of riches. They were brief, fleeting moments, filled with tension and silence, but they were enough to leave an impression. The Vikings knew they had encountered something ancient, something not easily understood, and something that they could not simply conquer with force or steel. For in the land of the Bjarmians, there was no room for the brashness of Viking ambition. There, in the silent forests of Bjarmaland, the Watcher stood, patient, silent, and always watching. In the mist-filled northern reaches of the world, where the land stretches endlessly beneath the pale sky, the Bjarmians lived a life both isolated and profound. Their history, long forgotten in the pages of time, unfolded quietly within the frozen landscapes of their homeland, far from the prying eyes of the outside world. Yet, like all peoples, their story was one of gradual rise, one of gathering strength amidst the isolation, before eventually becoming a force that both intrigued and terrified the Vikings who sought to explore the farthest reaches of the north. The Bjarmian people were not born into greatness. They did not rise through empire or conquest, but rather through the quiet, persistent force of their connection to the land. Their social structure, while not fully understood by the outside world, likely revolved around a tribal system, where chieftains or leaders held sway over small communities. The Bjarmians, though never unified in the manner of great kingdoms, were united in their identity with the land that surrounded them. They lived in scattered yet strong groups, tribes bound together by blood, tradition, and the shared knowledge of the harsh northern terrain. It was said that the most respected leaders were those who could navigate the land with ease, whose knowledge of the forest and the ice made them more than mere men. They were the stewards of their people's survival, their connection to the land a vital part of their role as guardians of the ancient, untouched wilderness. But what made the Bjarmians truly mysterious was not just their social structure, nor their deep-rooted traditions. It was the very essence of their culture, wrapped in a cloak of silence. The Bjarmians had no written records, no grand chronicles of their history penned in ink or stone. Their story was passed from generation to generation through spoken word, through the telling of myths and legends, through songs and dances that echoed across the snow-covered plains. The absence of written language left a gap in the historical record, a void that made the Bjarmians all the more enigmatic, even to those who encountered them. Without a written record, their lives were, in many ways, a mystery, shrouded in the kind of secrecy that only the passage of time could preserve. The absence of such records also meant that the Vikings, with their love for storytelling and the preservation of their own sagas, could never fully comprehend the depth of the Bjarmians' way of life. The Bjarmians, in their quiet existence, existed at the edges of the known world, faint shadows in the Viking imagination. Despite their lack of written records, the Bjarmians were far from isolated in the most absolute sense. They lived in a land that was central to trade routes connecting the east and the west. The White Sea, its cold waters rippling under the northern sun, played a crucial role in this network. The fjords, winding deep into the heart of the land, provided an almost natural highway, carved through the stone and ice, that allowed goods to travel to and from Bjarmaland. The Bjarmians, skilled in navigating these waters, were not merely passive participants in the flow of goods. They were active traders. Their boats, long and narrow, sliced through the icy waters with precision, carrying furs, silver, and other precious commodities from the north to the bustling trading hubs that lay further south. The Vikings, always eager to expand their reach, began to encounter these trade routes as they ventured deeper into the frozen north. As early as the 9th century, Viking traders, explorers, and raiders began to make their way toward the White Sea, seeking not only the riches of the East, but also the elusive knowledge of this strange people who lived beyond the forests. For the Vikings, the potential wealth of the region was undeniable. The fine furs, the rare silver, and the mysterious commodities that could only come from such a remote and unforgiving place. The Bjarmians, for their part, were not entirely hostile to the foreign traders. Rather, they exchanged goods in a way that was both cautious and measured. They understood the value of trade, and though their methods may have seemed foreign to the Vikings, there was a quiet respect in their exchanges. The trade was not built on the loud, boisterous demands that often marked Viking encounters with other peoples. It was conducted in a subtle, deliberate manner, guided by a deep understanding of the land and the goods that it could provide. This exchange, however, was not without tension. The Vikings, accustomed to conquest and domination, saw the Bjarmians as a people to be both feared and admired. While the Bjarmians welcomed trade, they were not easily conquered. Their land, with its frozen rivers and endless forests, was a difficult place to navigate for those who were unfamiliar with its ways. And the Bjarmians, skilled in the silent art of survival, knew how to use the terrain to their advantage. It was said that when the Vikings sought to push deeper into Bjarmaland, the Bjarmians would vanish into the forest like shadows, leaving the invaders lost and confused, trapped in the thick wilderness where the cold air and the vast emptiness of the land disoriented even the most seasoned of explorers. The Vikings, for all their strength and bravado, could not break through the quiet strength of the Bjarmians. They were a people connected to the land in a way that the Vikings, with all their iron and fire, could never fully comprehend. The trade routes that ran through the White Sea were crucial not just for the goods they carried, but for the quiet, implacable power that the Bjarmians wielded through their mastery of the land. These trade routes became the lifeblood of Bjarmaland, and through them the Bjarmians carved out a place for themselves in the world, not by conquest, but by the simple, unyielding power of their connection to the earth. And so, as the centuries passed, the Bjarmians rose in stature, though not through the wars or battles that the Vikings fought, but through the quiet strength of their culture, their deep knowledge of the land, and their mastery of the trade routes that connected the far north to the rest of the world. They became a people of influence in the north, their reputation whispered in the halls of Viking chieftains, their name etched into the ancient sagas as both a mystery and a force to be reckoned with. Though the Vikings would continue to venture into the frozen lands of the north, seeking to claim what they could from the mysterious people who lived there, they would never truly conquer Bjarmaland. For the Bjarmians were not a people who could be easily subdued. They were the guardians of the north, watching quietly from the shadows of the White Forest, their strength not in their numbers or their weapons, but in their profound connection to the land itself. And as the saga of the Bjarmians unfolded in the years that followed, they remained a people whose story was both deeply rooted in the ancient rhythms of the earth and whose legacy would echo through the corridors of Viking memory. A memory shaped not by written records, but by the whispers of those who had encountered them and lived to tell the tale. The land of the Bjarmians was a place where reality and myth danced so closely together that it became impossible to separate one from the other. The stillness of the White Forest, where shadows seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the pale sky, lent itself to the birth of stories of strange figures, whispered in the darkened corners of Viking longhouses and passed down through the centuries. These stories were not mere fantasy, but a deep reflection of the fear and awe that the Vikings felt toward the people of Bjarmaland, whose very existence seemed to stand at the threshold of the known world and the unknown. The most persistent of these stories was the legend of the Watchers, figures so enigmatic and powerful that they seemed to transcend the bounds of mere mortals. The Bjarmians, according to Viking accounts, were not ruled by kings or lords in the traditional sense. Instead, they were said to be guided by a mysterious figure, or perhaps several figures, who were called the Watchers or Guardians. These figures were often described as silent, ghostly presences who moved through the forest like shadows, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. In the dim, flickering light of a Viking hearth, these watchers took on the air of something otherworldly, beings who were more spirit than flesh, guardians of an ancient and untold knowledge, watching from the deep, mysterious heart of the forest. This idea of the Watchers, however, was not unique to the Bjarmians. In fact, the concept of powerful, unseen guardians was deeply woven into both Scandinavian and Slavic folklore, where such figures often represented forces of nature or protectors of sacred knowledge. In Norse mythology, one can find parallels in the mysterious beings who guarded the sacred realms, from the Watchers of the gods to the hidden spirits who dwelled in the forests and mountains. These figures were often seen as protectors of secrets, keepers of wisdom that could not be passed to just anyone, only to those who had proven themselves worthy. The Watchers in Bjarmian legend may have been seen as keepers of the ancient ways, a people who, unlike the Vikings, had not forgotten the old traditions of the earth, the rhythms of the forest, and the spirits that danced beneath the snow. Perhaps they were thought to be the last remnants of a time before the Vikings' reach stretched into the northern territories, a connection to something older and more primal. This idea of the Watchers, those silent and powerful figures in the shadows, struck at the heart of Viking fears that grew as the Bjarmians became both a literal and figurative wall at the edge of the Viking world. In many of the sagas, the Bjarmians were depicted as an uncanny presence, mysterious and eerie figures who could seemingly vanish into the landscape at will. Their skill in moving through the forest, as though they were part of it, only deepened the sense of them as beings tied to something ancient. In these sagas, the Bjarmians would appear at the edges of the Viking world, their silent forms slipping through the shadows of the trees like phantoms. They were described as warriors, but not in the manner of Viking raiders. The sagas were quick to describe the Bjarmians as possessing an almost supernatural calm, an ability to fight with a quiet, terrifying skill that made them seem as though they were born from the forest itself. In these accounts, the Watchers did not fight with rage or noise, but with a cold, precise force that left the Vikings in awe and trepidation. The fear of the Watchers was not just about their skill in battle. It was also the fear of what they represented: the unknown, the ancient, and the untamable forces of nature that had existed long before the Vikings began their conquests. The Watchers, it seemed, were not just a people to be feared for their physical strength, but for their deep connection to the land and the timeless wisdom they held. The Bjarmians, with their mysterious ways and quiet presence, seemed to be a living reminder to the Vikings that there were forces far beyond their control, forces tied to the very fabric of the earth itself. The Watchers also served as a symbol of the Bjarmians' refusal to be conquered, even by the might of Viking swords and shields. The sagas tell of Viking expeditions that ventured deep into the heart of Bjarmaland, hoping to subdue the land and its people. But these expeditions often ended in failure, with the Vikings unable to either find the Bjarmians or force them into submission. The Bjarmians seemed to possess a quiet invincibility, vanishing into the forest whenever they were threatened, leaving only the strange sense that they had been watched, always, patiently, from the shadows. The more the Vikings encountered these elusive figures, the more the stories of the Watchers grew in power. Over time, these tales became more than mere stories. They became a part of the Viking psyche. To the Vikings, the Watchers were no longer just strange figures who lived beyond the forest. They were a force of nature itself, a manifestation of the very land they inhabited, and a reminder of what lay beyond the reach of the Viking world. The legends of the Watchers fueled both Viking fears and their desires for conquest. The more the Vikings heard of these figures, of their skill, of their eerie calm, and of their deep connection to the earth, the more they felt both a sense of reverence and terror. In the sagas, these encounters between the Vikings and the Bjarmians were often rendered in dramatic terms. The Bjarmians were portrayed as fearsome warriors who, though few in number, could strike with terrifying precision. They were guardians, protectors of their land, who had lived in the wilderness for centuries, and had mastered the ways of the forest in ways the Vikings could never fully understand. As the Vikings ventured deeper into the northern wilderness, these stories became a part of the narrative of exploration and conquest, both an allure and a warning to those who dared to go too far. What was the true nature of the Bjarmians and of the watchers that guarded them? Were they, as some believed, the last remnants of an ancient race of guardians, entrusted with the secrets of the earth and the forces that lay beyond? Or were they merely a terrifying mystery, figures born of the Vikings' fear of the unknown, amplified by their encounters with a people whose ways they could never fully grasp? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. The Bjarmians were both real and myth, both guardians and mysterious beings whose legend would continue to haunt the edges of the Viking world, whispering across the winds that swept through the white forest. The Watchers, in all their shadowed majesty, would remain forever a part of the stories told around Viking fires, a symbol of all that was wild and untamable in the land of the Bjarmians, a force that could never be fully understood, but would always be felt, deep in the bones, in the heart of the north. The land of Bjarmaland had long been a place of whispered legends, of shadows moving between the trees, of an ancient people whose ways were as mysterious as the forest that sheltered them. But as the Vikings expanded their reach across the north, those legends began to turn into something far more tangible, a violent clash between two peoples whose worlds could not have been more different. The first major encounters between the Vikings and the Bjarmians were not just battles. They were a turning point, shaping the Viking perception of these elusive people, and leaving an indelible mark on their strategies as they pushed further east. One of the earliest, most famous accounts of a conflict between the Bjarmians and the Vikings is the Battle of the White Sea. The saga accounts tell a tale of a great clash on the frozen waters of the sea, where Viking warriors met the Bjarmians in a violent confrontation that has since become legendary. According to these stories, the Vikings, eager to subdue the Bjarmians and claim their land, sailed deep into the northern waters, seeking to raid and conquer. But the Bjarmians, though few in number, were ready to defend their homeland. With their silent, ghostly movements through the forests, they took the Vikings by surprise, attacking with precision and skill that left the invaders stunned. The saga accounts speak of a battle on the ice, where the Bjarmians, utilizing their knowledge of the terrain, lured the Vikings into traps, striking swiftly before vanishing back into the snow and trees. The battle was said to be fierce, but the Viking forces were overwhelmed by the Bjarmian resistance, forcing them to retreat back to their ships. The Vikings, who were accustomed to conquering lands and people with overwhelming force, found themselves caught off guard by the Bjarmians' tactics that seemed both strange and terrifying in their efficiency. The battle became a symbol of the Bjarmians' resilience, their ability to defend their land against even the might of the Vikings, and their mastery of the northern wilderness. But was this battle real? Did it truly unfold as the sagas describe, with the Bjarmians defeating the Viking raiders in the heart of the White Sea? Archaeological evidence offers little confirmation of such a dramatic confrontation. There are no signs of a large-scale battle in the region, no buried weapons or mass graves to suggest a violent clash on the scale described in the sagas. However, this does not entirely dismiss the idea that there were violent encounters between the Vikings and the Bjarmians, though they may have been smaller in scale, more scattered, and not as monumental as the sagas suggest. What the sagas do capture, however, is the deep sense of fear and awe that the Vikings felt toward the Bjarmians, a people who seemed to be able to fight with a skill and precision that was unsettling, especially given their small numbers. For the Vikings, raiding and conquering were an integral part of their identity. They were accustomed to striking swiftly, overpowering smaller tribes and settlements with their longships and weapons. But the Bjarmians were different. Their resistance was not born of brute strength or vast numbers, but of deep knowledge of the land and the ability to move through it like ghosts. The Vikings, with their iron and fire, were not prepared for this. This was a fight not for territory, but for survival itself, a struggle against a people whose connection to their land ran deeper than the Vikings could have ever imagined. The Viking raids on Bjarmian settlements, which began in earnest during the 9th and 10th centuries, were marked by frustration and failure. The Vikings would sail up the fjords of the White Sea, seeking to capture land, take slaves, or acquire goods. But each time they arrived, the Bjarmians were ready. They would disappear into the forests, leaving no trace behind, only to return later with lightning speed to strike against the invaders. The Vikings found that their usual methods of attack, those swift, brutal raids, were not effective in this new environment. The thick forests and the long, cold winters made it difficult to maintain a strong presence in Bjarmaland, and the Bjarmians, skilled in navigating the harsh terrain, seemed to always be one step ahead. One of the most unsettling aspects of these early encounters for the Vikings was the Bjarmians' combat techniques. The sagas speak of the Bjarmians fighting not in the large, coordinated groups that the Vikings were used to, but in small, elusive bands, fighters who appeared from the shadows like wraiths, striking with a precision that was almost supernatural. Their weapons, while not as large or imposing as the Viking swords and axes, were perfectly suited to the terrain of the north. Long spears, sharp knives, and bows that could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy from between the trees were the tools of the Bjarmian warrior. And it was not just their weapons that made them formidable. It was their way of fighting, their understanding of the land, and their ability to disappear into the wilderness at a moment's notice. This type of warfare, swift, silent, and seemingly endless, was something the Vikings were not prepared for. It forced them to rethink their approach to conquest in the north, as they realized that brute force alone would not be enough to subdue the Bjarmians. The Viking raids on Bjarmian settlements, once seen as a way to claim riches and land, turned into something more complex, a struggle not just for physical dominance, but for control of the very heart of the north. The Vikings, used to conquering with overwhelming might, found themselves caught in a war of attrition, one where they could not always predict where or when the next attack would come, and where victory was not guaranteed. In many ways, these early encounters shaped the Viking approach to the eastern regions. The fear and frustration felt by Viking raiders in Bjarmaland led them to adapt their strategies in the north. Rather than relying solely on raids, they began to develop new methods of dealing with the Bjarmians, methods that combined both force and diplomacy. They sought alliances with other tribes in the region, using trade and negotiation to gain access to the lands and resources they coveted. They also increased their efforts to learn the ways of the Bjarmians, studying their tactics and their methods of survival in the harsh northern wilderness. However, despite these adjustments, the Vikings would never fully conquer the Bjarmians or their land. The resistance they encountered in the north proved to be too great, and the Bjarmians, with their deep knowledge of the land, remained an unyielding force. The Vikings, despite their might, could not overcome the quiet strength of the Bjarmians, their ability to survive, to fight with eerie precision, and to fade into the shadows when necessary. And so, the early violent encounters between the Vikings and the Bjarmians became a defining moment in the history of the North. The Vikings, for all their strength, could not break the spirit of the Bjarmians. They remained a people whose land and culture could not be easily conquered, whose legends of the Watchers would continue to haunt the minds of those who ventured too far into the north. The impact of these early conflicts shaped the Viking perception of the Bjarmians as both a mysterious people and a formidable foe, a people whose legacy would live on in the silent echoes of the White Forest, forever a part of the Viking mythos. As the years passed, the Vikings' reach continued to grow, stretching farther and farther into the unknown corners of the world. Their longships, sleek and powerful, carved through rivers and across seas, their sails billowing in the wind as they sought out new lands to conquer, new peoples to trade with, and new riches to claim. Their ambition was as boundless as the seas themselves, and their eyes turned ever further eastward toward the unknown lands that lay beyond the White Sea. It was there, in the icy wilderness of the north, that the Vikings' greatest dream began to take shape. The dream of a northern passage, a route that would open up new realms of wealth and power, linking them with the fabled treasures of the East. At the heart of this dream lay Bjarmaland, a land both mysterious and alluring, its forests and fjords hiding secrets that the Vikings longed to uncover. The Bjarmians, whose name had already become synonymous with mystery and skill, were more than just a curiosity to the Vikings. They were a key to unlocking the trade routes that led deeper into the vast unknown. The search for the Northern Passage was not just a quest for land, it was a quest for wealth, for access to the riches of the Silk Road, for the spices and silks that flowed from Byzantium, and for the gold and treasures that lay beyond the horizon. The Vikings understood that the key to all of this lay to the north, and Bjarmaland was the gateway. The Vikings had already established trade routes that wound through the rivers of Eastern Europe, carving their way through the dense forests of Russia and into the heart of the Byzantine Empire. They had made their way along the Volga River, where they traded furs and slaves for goods from the east, and they had established themselves as an important part of the trading networks that stretched all the way to Constantinople. But there was more to be gained, more to be discovered, and the Vikings' desire to push beyond the known world drove them toward the northern coast, where the Bjarmians were the guardians of this elusive passage. The Bjarmians, despite their enigmatic ways, were not isolated from the world of trade. In fact, they played a crucial role as intermediaries in the exchange of goods between the Vikings and the Byzantine Empire, and even beyond that, toward the Silk Road. The flow of goods from the east to the west passed through their hands, as the Bjarmians facilitated trade between distant lands. They were well versed in the intricacies of commerce, understanding both the value of what they traded and the value of what they guarded. Through the White Sea, goods were carried in small boats and longships, crossing treacherous waters and bringing the furs, pelts, and other treasures of the north to the far reaches of the empire. The Vikings, in turn, sought to establish closer ties with the Bjarmians, eager to build on this existing trade and secure their place in the ever-growing web of commerce. Their ships, laden with iron and silver, ventured deeper into the northern waters, hoping to strike deals that would grant them access to the wealth of the East. The Bjarmians, however, remained cautious, always aware of the delicate balance between alliance and rivalry. For the Bjarmians, trade was not just a means of survival, it was a way of maintaining their strength in a world that sought to encroach upon their land. Yet, despite their wariness, they recognized the potential in the Viking traders. The Vikings brought with them goods and knowledge that could benefit both peoples, iron, weapons, and tools that the Bjarmians could not produce themselves. This exchange, though peaceful at times, was also fraught with tension. The Vikings, driven by their insatiable ambition, were not content with merely trading. They desired more. They wanted access to the wealth of the East, the treasures that had eluded them for so long, and they saw the Bjarmians as both a barrier and a bridge to that dream. It was in these early encounters, between the exchange of goods and the delicate negotiations, that the Vikings' obsession with the North began to take shape in earnest. As the centuries wore on, the Bjarmians, despite their isolation, became a symbol in the Viking imagination, a symbol of the unknown, a people who guarded the northern passage to riches and power. To the Vikings, the Bjarmians represented both the dream and the fear of what lay beyond the horizon. The lands of the east, rich with silk, spices and gold, could be reached, but only through the frozen waters of the White Sea, where the Bjarmians held the key to unlocking these routes. The growing Viking obsession with the north, with Bjarmaland, and with the elusive passage through the icy waters, would come to shape their strategies for the centuries to follow. As Viking traders pushed further into the unknown, seeking to expand their trade routes and deepen their influence in the eastern regions, they found themselves continually drawn to the north. The lure of the riches, the promise of untold wealth, and the enigma of the Bjarmians would drive them ever onward into the mysterious heart of the northern wilderness. And yet, for all their ambition and desire to conquer the east, the Vikings could not forget the one thing that made the Bjarmians so elusive: the Watchers, those silent guardians who stood between the Vikings and the riches they sought. The Bjarmians were not just traders or allies. They were a force to be reckoned with, and their strength lay not in the number of men they could field, nor in the wealth they held, but in their connection to the land and the ancient knowledge they guarded. The Bjarmians had learned to thrive in the harshest conditions, and they had learned the art of survival, both in trade and in war, in ways the Vikings could not fully understand. For the Vikings, the North represented a place of both possibility and peril, a place where their dreams of wealth and power collided with the harsh realities of the land and the people who lived there. The quest for the northern passage, with the Bjarmians standing as both guides and gatekeepers, would become one of the driving forces behind Viking expansion, shaping the course of their future and forever entwining their fate with the enigmatic people who called Bjarmaland home. The land of the Bjarmians, shrouded in the icy mists of the north, was not just a place of violent conflict and fierce resistance. It was also a land where diplomacy, silent and deliberate, played a crucial role. For the Vikings, accustomed to direct confrontation, the Bjarmians' subtle art of negotiation presented a challenge unlike any other. The Bjarmians did not follow the typical rules of Viking diplomacy, which was often loud and forceful. Instead, they wove a quiet and enigmatic web of exchange, one where trade and fear were intertwined with remarkable precision. At the heart of this diplomacy stood the Bjarmian chieftains, whose role was far more than that of mere rulers. These leaders, though few in number, were the gatekeepers to a world of trade that stretched from the White Sea to the lands of Byzantium and beyond. To the Vikings, they were both revered and feared, figures whose words carried the weight of ancient knowledge, whose decisions could shift the balance of power in the frozen north. The Bjarmian chieftains were not the kind of leaders who would stand on the battlefield and rally their people with forceful commands. Instead, their power lay in their ability to navigate the subtle currents of diplomacy, to keep the Vikings at arm's length while still facilitating trade. In these early encounters, the Vikings found that negotiating with the Bjarmians was unlike any other exchange they had undertaken. The Bjarmians did not seek to dominate their visitors, nor did they offer their goods freely. Instead, they engaged in quiet meetings, often conducted in the shadowed forests, away from the prying eyes of the Viking raiders. These meetings were shrouded in a kind of formality that the Vikings struggled to understand. They would often take place at dusk, when the fog hung thick in the air and the light was dim, lending the proceedings a ghostly quality. The Bjarmians, ever the masters of subtlety, would arrive in small, discreet groups, cloaked in the mystery of the wilderness. These exchanges were quiet affairs, marked by a sense of ritual more than anything else. Words were measured, not rushed, and much of the communication was done through gestures and the exchange of goods. The trade itself was simple but essential. The Vikings, with their long ships and hard-earned wealth, brought iron, weapons, and tools, things that the Bjarmians could not make themselves. In return, the Bjarmians offered furs, pelts, and the much-coveted Bjarmian silver, a precious metal that was said to be unlike any other, its shine smooth and pure, coveted by the traders of Byzantium and the Silk Road. The silver was one of the Bjarmians' most valuable commodities, and its quality ensured that it would be a key piece in the trade network that stretched across the northern lands. The Vikings, ever the opportunists, recognized the value of this exchange, but they also understood that securing a steady supply of Bjarmian silver required more than just the sword. It required patience, respect, and an understanding of the delicate balance that the Bjarmians maintained in their dealings. Yet, even as the Vikings sought to negotiate with the Bjarmians, they could not fully escape the shadow of fear that loomed over every interaction. The Vikings, for all their prowess in battle, were not entirely secure in their dealings with the Bjarmians. The very customs that made the Bjarmians so enigmatic, their quiet, calculated approach to diplomacy, kept the Vikings on edge. The Vikings, accustomed to brash and open exchanges, were often baffled by the Bjarmians' restraint. There was no loud bargaining, no overt display of wealth or power. Instead, the Bjarmians would appear with their trade goods, laid out in quiet abundance, and wait for the Vikings to make the first move. These moments, where silence hung heavy in the air, were charged with tension, a silent acknowledgement that the Bjarmians too held power in this exchange. In these meetings, the Vikings were not just negotiating for goods, they were negotiating for their very understanding of the North. The Bjarmians, through their silence and restraint, became symbols of the unknown, of a people whose way of life was foreign, inscrutable, and ultimately terrifying. The Vikings, in their eagerness to conquer and dominate, found themselves humbled by the Bjarmians' quiet authority, which spoke volumes in ways that the Vikings could not fully comprehend. For the Bjarmians, the exchange was not just about trade, it was about maintaining control, about ensuring that the flow of goods would not upset the delicate balance of power they had cultivated with the outside world. The Viking traders, although familiar with the art of commerce, found themselves in a position they had not anticipated, one where they were not the ones in control. Instead, they were forced to play by the Bjarmians' rules, to understand the language of silence, and to recognize the strength that lay in not speaking. The Vikings, who had built their empire on the strength of their raiding and their ability to assert dominance, were now forced to reconsider their assumptions. They had long believed that power came from force and might, but in Bjarmaland they found that power could also come from the quiet mastery of diplomacy, from the understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing one could do was wait. In time, the Vikings came to respect, and perhaps even fear, the Bjarmians' approach to diplomacy. They understood that the Bjarmians were not just traders, they were guardians of something much more significant. The Bjarmians' land, their silver, and their control over the northern trade routes were all part of a greater strategy, one that the Vikings could only begin to understand. The exchange of goods was one thing, but the exchange of respect, the silent recognition of each other's power, was something entirely different. And in this quiet diplomacy, in the hushed tones and unspoken gestures of the Bjarmians, the Vikings began to realize that the North and the people who lived there would never be fully conquered by force alone. The role of Bjarmian diplomacy, built on silence and respect, would continue to shape the relationship between the Vikings and the Bjarmians in the years to come. The Vikings, who had once believed that they could bend the North to their will, would come to see that the Bjarmians were a people who could never be fully controlled. Their strength lay not in what they said or did, but in their ability to remain a mystery, a silent force in the frozen wilderness that could never be fully understood. And so, the Vikings would continue to tread carefully in Bjarmaland, forever aware that the Bjarmians, with their quiet power, held the keys to the northern passage, a passage that remained elusive, even to the most determined of raiders. As the centuries passed, the once formidable people of Bjarmaland began to fade into the mists of history, their once vibrant presence in the northern world slipping quietly away. The shadowy figures of the Watchers, those silent and ghostly guardians of the White Forest, seemed to vanish just as mysteriously as they had appeared. The Bjarmians, who had once held such an enigmatic grip on the imagination of the Vikings, saw their power gradually erode, slipping away like the retreating ice of a thawing winter. But what caused this shift? What led to the decline of the Bjarmians, who had once been a people so fierce and proud? One of the primary factors in the decline of Bjarmian power was the rise of the Novgorod Republic, a growing force to the south. The Republic, emerging as a powerful and strategic trading hub, began to assert its dominance over the northern territories, including the lands once controlled by the Bjarmians. Novgorod, with its stronghold on the Volga River, became an influential player in the trade networks of the region, its merchants and warriors steadily encroaching upon Bjarmian lands. While the Bjarmians had once acted as intermediaries between the Vikings and the Byzantine Empire, the Novgorodians began to take over these trade routes, establishing their own network of alliances and increasingly overshadowing the Bjarmians in both wealth and influence. This shift in power did not go unnoticed by the Vikings, who once deeply invested in the northern trade routes, gradually turned their attention elsewhere. The allure of the riches and the trade opportunities offered by the lands of the East began to wane, as the Vikings expanded their reach into other parts of Europe and the British Isles. The expansion of Viking interests southward and westward into the more fertile and accessible lands of the British Isles and beyond diminished their focus on the far northern territories. The once vibrant trade between the Vikings and the Bjarmians faded, replaced by new, more lucrative ventures, as the Vikings turned their gaze away from the distant, frozen north. At the same time, the rise of Russian influence further contributed to the decline of the Bjarmians. The expanding power of the Russian states, particularly the Kievan Rus, began to exert its pressure on the northern territories, seeking to claim lands that had once been under Bjarmian control. The Russians, with their expanding territories and growing military power, gradually encroached on the land of the Bjarmians, pushing them further into the wilderness. As the Kievan Rus spread its reach, the once independent Bjarmians found themselves caught between the conflicting forces of Novgorod and Russia, unable to maintain the sovereignty they had once enjoyed. The impact of Russian expansion into the northern territories was both gradual and relentless. The Bjarmians, once masters of their land and revered for their skill in both trade and warfare, found themselves increasingly isolated, their cultural and political influence steadily eroding. Russian settlers began to move into the Bjarmian territories, establishing settlements and trading posts, gradually replacing the native structures with their own. Over time, these new settlers absorbed the Bjarmians into the larger Russian cultural and political sphere, and the once proud people of Bjarmaland were slowly assimilated into the expanding Russian Empire. The final resistance of the Bjarmians, though fierce, was ultimately insufficient to halt their decline. In the face of the growing powers of Novgorod and Russia, the Bjarmians' ability to maintain their independence and cultural identity dwindled. The small, elusive groups that had once made up the heart of Bjarmian society were no match for the larger, more organized forces that swept across their lands. The once proud chieftains who had negotiated quietly with the Vikings found themselves powerless against the waves of Russian expansion. The lands that had once been home to the Watchers were no longer theirs to protect, as the cultural identity of the Bjarmians dissolved into the larger forces at play. For the Vikings, the decline of the Bjarmians marked the end of an era. No longer would they look northward with the same sense of mystery and awe that had once defined their relationship with the Bjarmians. The strange and powerful people who had guarded the northern reaches were no more, their culture and identity absorbed by the expanding Russian state. The legends of the Bjarmians, once whispered around Viking hearths, began to fade into the past, becoming little more than stories of a forgotten people, a shadow of what they had once been. The decline of the Bjarmians was not just the loss of a people, but the loss of a certain way of life, a way of life that had been both mysterious and awe-inspiring, rooted in the frozen forests of the north and the depths of the unknown. As the Bjarmians were absorbed into the Russian world, their once vibrant culture began to disappear, leaving behind only faint traces in the chronicles of the past. The White Forest, which had once been the domain of the Watchers, became just another part of the vast Russian wilderness, no longer a place of mystery and power, but a quiet, forgotten corner of the world. The disappearance of the Bjarmians from history was not a sudden event, but rather a slow and inexorable process. Their once great influence waned as the tides of history shifted, and their story became less and less a part of the broader narrative of the North. Yet, even as their power faded, the Bjarmians remained a part of the Viking mythos, a symbol of the unknown, of the wild and untamable forces of nature that had once seemed so close, but now seemed impossibly far away. As the centuries passed, the Bjarmians, once a dominant force in the northern world, faded into legend. Their land, their culture, and their identity were absorbed by the larger empires that rose around them, but their legacy lived on in the stories and myths that were told for generations to come. The Watchers, those silent guardians of the White Forest, would remain in the hearts of the Vikings, haunting their dreams and imaginations, a reminder of a people who were both feared and revered, and who had once stood at the very edge of the known world. Even as the Bjarmians faded from the physical world, their presence continued to linger in the distant echoes of Viking memory. Their land, once a place of mystery and power, slowly became an afterthought in the broader saga of the North. But despite their decline, the memory of the Bjarmians would not fade so easily. The Watchers, those silent and enigmatic guardians of the White Forest, lived on in the hearts of the Vikings, their stories passed down through generations, woven into the very fabric of Viking legend. Long after their power had diminished, the Bjarmians remained a symbol of the unknown, a haunting presence that continued to stir the Viking imagination. The last mentions of the Bjarmians in Norse literature, though few, still carried the weight of ancient fear and reverence. In the sagas, the Bjarmians were no longer portrayed as a formidable force in the present, but as a shadowy memory from the past. A people who had once guarded the northern reaches, whose land was now lost to the growing power of Novgorod and the expanding Russian territories. Yet, the Vikings' interpretations of what had happened to the Bjarmians were far from straightforward. Did the Bjarmians disappear entirely, wiped from history in a final crushing defeat? Or had they simply been absorbed into other tribes, their culture and identity swallowed up by the vast, shifting tides of time? The sagas were ambiguous, offering no clear answer to the fate of the Bjarmians. Some Viking accounts suggested that the Bjarmians were destroyed in a final, catastrophic clash, one last desperate stand against the forces that encroached upon their land. Others, however, painted a different picture, one in which the Bjarmians quietly assimilated into neighboring cultures, their once distinct identity gradually blending with the growing powers of Russia and Novgorod. The Vikings, for all their tales of conquest and adventure, were left with only a lingering sense of mystery, a sense that the Bjarmians had simply faded into the annals of history without a trace. But whether the Bjarmians had been wiped out or absorbed, one thing remained certain: their legacy continued to haunt the Viking consciousness. Even as their once great power vanished, the stories of the Bjarmians lived on in the sagas, passed down through the ages. The Bjarmians had become symbols of the wild, untamable North, of a people who had once stood as guardians of a mysterious land, whose silence and stealth had struck fear into the hearts of the Vikings. The Vikings, who had conquered so many lands with their swords and fire, had never truly conquered the Bjarmians, and it was this, perhaps more than anything, that kept their memory alive in the hearts of the Norse. For future generations of Vikings and explorers, the Bjarmians were no longer just a people. They were an idea, a symbol of the unknown. Their land, once a place of icy fjords and dense forests, became synonymous with the wild and the untamed, the frontier that lay just beyond the edge of the known world. The Vikings, who had sailed to the furthest reaches of the earth, had still not fully charted the north, and the Bjarmians were a reminder of that unfinished journey. In the sagas and in the minds of future explorers, the Bjarmians represented something more than just a tribe. They represented the ultimate mystery of the North, the last frontier where the unknown still reigned supreme. The Bjarmians' influence extended far beyond their time, shaping the Viking imagination for centuries. As Norse explorers continued to venture into the wild, northern lands, they did so with the shadow of the Bjarmians lingering in the back of their minds. The Viking expeditions to Greenland, Iceland, and the Americas, lands that lay far to the west, were not just driven by the search for riches or new territories, but by a deeper, more primal urge to discover what lay beyond the known world. And in this quest for the unknown, the memory of the Bjarmians remained a guiding force, a reminder of the mysteries that still waited to be uncovered. The Bjarmians, though long gone from the world of the living, had become something more than just a lost people. They had become a symbol of the wild, uncharted lands, a symbol of the mysteries that still awaited those brave enough to venture into the unknown. The Vikings, who had once feared and revered the Bjarmians, now looked to their legacy as they sailed farther and farther from their homeland. The Bjarmians had taught them, in their silence and in their resistance, that the true challenge of the North was not in the lands they could conquer, but in the lands they could never fully understand. And so, the Bjarmians remained, a quiet, powerful force in the Viking imagination, haunting their dreams and inspiring their explorations. Their story, woven into the fabric of Viking legend, continued to echo through the ages, reminding the Norse of a people who had once stood as silent guardians of a mysterious land. And in that silence, in that mystery, the Bjarmians had left an indelible mark on the history of the North, one that would never truly fade, no matter how much time passed, no matter how far the Vikings sailed. The Watchers of the White Forest had become a part of the Viking mythos, forever a symbol of the untamed, unexplored North, a land where the unknown still whispered just beyond the reach of the known world. In the quiet, patient unfolding of time, the story of the Bjarmians, once hidden in the fog of history, has begun to resurface. The Watchers of the White Forest, whose whispered presence haunted the dreams of Viking explorers, whose trade routes crossed the icy expanses of the White Sea, have once again become a topic of interest in the modern world. For centuries, the true story of the Bjarmians was obscured, buried beneath the shifting sands of time. But in recent decades, a renewed interest has sparked an effort to uncover the lost history of this mysterious people. Historians, archaeologists, and explorers, each driven by the same insatiable curiosity that once propelled the Vikings themselves, have begun to piece together the scattered fragments of the Bjarmian legacy, hoping to unravel the enigma that has lingered for so long. Through the diligent work of archaeologists, some answers have begun to emerge from the silence of the past. Excavations in the northern regions, near the White Sea, and along the rivers that once marked the trade routes of the Bjarmians, have revealed artifacts that offer a glimpse into their culture and society. These discoveries, though few, have proven invaluable in shedding light on the material life of the Bjarmians, their tools, their crafts, their way of life. Among the most significant finds have been the remnants of settlements and burial sites, where objects of trade, including the famous Bjarmian silver, have been uncovered. These small but important pieces of history help to paint a picture of a people who, despite their disappearance, left behind traces of their existence for those who would come after them. Yet, for all the evidence uncovered, the true story of the Bjarmians remains elusive. The lack of written records, combined with the limited nature of archaeological findings, means that much of their history remains shrouded in mystery. What little we know of the Bjarmians comes primarily from external sources, the accounts of the Vikings, the sagas, and the stories passed down through generations. These stories, while valuable, are colored by the perspective of the Vikings, who saw the Bjarmians not just as a people, but as a symbol of the unknown, the untamable North. The Vikings, after all, had their own reasons for telling the stories they did, stories of fear, awe, and respect for a people they could not fully understand. Despite these challenges, modern historians continue to search for the truth about the Bjarmians, driven by the same fascination that once led the Vikings to the northern lands. They are motivated by the desire to uncover the lives of a people who were, for a time, at the very edge of history, and who now exist only in the quiet echoes of ancient sagas. In their search, they are uncovering new perspectives on the Bjarmians, not as mere subjects of Viking conquest, but as a people with their own complex history, one that deserves to be told on its own terms. This journey into the past is not just about historical discovery. It is also about understanding the ways in which history is shaped and remembered. The mystery of the Bjarmians, why they remained so enigmatic for so long, speaks to the larger questions of how we tell stories and how those stories are passed down through generations. The Bjarmians, once feared and revered by the Vikings, have become a symbol of the unknown, their legacy woven into the very fabric of Viking myth and legend. Their memory has persisted, not because of what they left behind, but because of what they represented: the frontier, the untamed wilderness that lay just beyond the reach of the known world. The Bjarmians' lasting impression on modern storytelling is undeniable. Though their story is fragmented, their presence in the sagas, the legends, and the myths of the Viking world continues to influence our understanding of the past. In many ways, they have come to represent the ultimate mystery, the unknown that we can never fully uncover. Their silence, their absence, and their power as a symbol of the untamed North have left a lasting mark on our cultural imagination. In the stories of the Vikings, the Bjarmians became more than just a people. They became a metaphor for the dangers and wonders that lie beyond the horizon, in the wild, unknown lands that still beckon to those who dare to explore. Today, the Bjarmians continue to hold a place in the collective memory of both historians and storytellers. Their story, though incomplete, serves as a reminder that some mysteries, though they may never be fully solved, are worth seeking. The journey to uncover their history, to understand their place in the world, continues to inspire those who look to the past with the same wonder that the Vikings once did. And so, the story of the Bjarmians, though it may never be fully told, remains a testament to the enduring power of the unknown, to the allure of the wild north and the peoples who once stood guard over its secrets. In this quiet reflection, the legacy of the Bjarmians lives on, not in the tangible artifacts or the written words that have survived, but in the stories we continue to tell about them, the watchers who once stood silent in the forest, guarding the northern reaches, and whose echoes still call to us from the past. For in the end, it is the mystery of the Bjarmians, their silence, their absence, and their elusive presence, that continues to captivate the hearts and minds of those who look to the north. And perhaps, in this quiet remembrance, they will forever remain a part of the northern world, a symbol of all that is wild, untamed, and beyond our reach. As we come to the end of our quiet journey through the saga of the Bjarmians, we find ourselves standing on the edge of a deep and tranquil mystery, one that stretches out into the distant fog of history, just as the lands of Bjarmaland once lay beyond the known world. The tale of the Bjarmians, those silent watchers of the white forest, has unfolded slowly before us, layer by layer, as we have sought to piece together the fragments of a people who, though long gone, continue to stir the imagination. And now, in this final reflection, we are invited to look back upon the story, not with the urgency of discovery, but with the peaceful contemplation that comes with understanding the delicate dance between history and myth. History, as we have come to realize, is often an elusive thing, one that slips through our fingers like sand, leaving only traces behind. The written records are sparse, the voices of the past faint, and the interpretations of those who came before us varied and sometimes conflicting. The story of the Bjarmians is no exception. Their culture, their way of life, their very existence has been left in the shadows of time. Much of what we know about them comes not from their own words, but from the accounts of others, Vikings who feared and revered them, traders who sought their silver, and explorers who ventured into their mysterious lands. The Bjarmians left behind no written records of their own, no chronicles or scripts to tell their side of the story. Instead, their legacy has been passed down through the quiet whispers of myth and memory. This uncertainty, this absence of clear records, speaks to something deeper, the power of myth in shaping collective memory. The Bjarmians, though they left no written history, became part of the rich tapestry of Viking lore, woven into the sagas and stories that still echo through the ages. In the absence of hard facts, it is the myths, the legends, and the whispered tales that preserve the essence of a people. The Bjarmians, as we have come to understand them, are not just a forgotten tribe, but a symbol of the countless peoples throughout history, whose stories remain incomplete, whose voices were never fully heard, but whose presence lingers in the silent spaces between the lines of history. As we reflect on the Bjarmians, we are reminded of the many cultures, societies, and individuals who have come before us, whose lives and legacies have been lost or obscured by the passage of time. History, in its most honest form, is a patchwork quilt, made up of fragments, threads of stories that, when woven together, create a picture that is never entirely complete. The Bjarmians, in their silence, are a reminder of this uncertainty, of the many mysteries that remain unanswered, and of the people whose lives have left only faint echoes in the collective memory. And yet, in this very silence, there is something powerful. For even in their absence, the Bjarmians continue to be a presence in the world today. Their story, though fragmentary, still resonates, both in the scholarly pursuits of historians and archaeologists, and in the imaginations of those who hear the whispers of their legend. In academia, Their legacy lives on in the ongoing efforts to uncover the truth of their existence, to bring their story out of the shadows and into the light. Archaeological discoveries, though few, continue to provide glimpses into their world, revealing the traces of a culture that was once both feared and revered. In this way, the Bjarmians are far from forgotten. They remain a subject of curiosity, a reminder that history is not always what it seems, and that the past is often more mysterious than we can imagine. In the broader world of popular culture, the Bjarmians live on as well, their legacy lingering in the stories we continue to tell. They have become symbols of the unknown, of the wild, untamable north, where the land is shaped by the harsh winds of winter and the silence of the ancient forests. In many ways, they represent the mysteries that still exist in our world, the places that remain unexplored, the peoples whose stories remain untold. The Bjarmians, in their quiet existence, have become a metaphor for all the forgotten corners of history, where the stories are not yet finished, and where the past still calls out to us, waiting to be discovered. As we conclude this journey through the Bjarmian saga, we are left with a quiet reflection. The story of the Bjarmians, though incomplete, is no less powerful for it. It is a story of mystery, of silence, and of the places and peoples that exist on the edges of our understanding. The Bjarmians are a reminder that history is not always about facts and figures, but about the stories that are told, and the ones that remain untold. They are a symbol of the unknown, and in their quiet watch over the northern lands, they continue to inspire awe and wonder in all who seek to understand the past. In the end, the Bjarmians remind us that some mysteries are meant to remain elusive. Their legacy, woven into the fabric of Viking myth and memory, is a testament to the power of the unknown, of the untamed places in history that continue to shape our collective imagination. As we turn the page on their story, we are left with the knowledge that, though we may never fully uncover the truth of the Bjarmians, their presence will remain, quietly watching over the northern reaches, just beyond the edge of the known world. And so, as the journey through the Bjarmian saga comes to a close, we are left with the peaceful understanding that some stories, though incomplete, are perfect in their mystery. The Watchers of the White Forest, though they have long since faded from history, remain a part of our collective memory, a silent reminder that, even in the silence of time, the past continues to speak.